Hi, this evening's reading is taken from Ezra, chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. Rebuilding the altar. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled together as one in Jerusalem. Then Joshua, son of Jozadak, and his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates, began to build the altar of the God of Israel, to sacrifice burnt offerings on it, in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. After that, they presented the regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for all the appointed sacred festivals of the Lord, as well as those brought as freewill offerings to the Lord. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. Then they gave money to the masons and carpenters, and gave food and drink and olive oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus, king of Persia. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Barbara, and I want to invite Fiona to come up. It was nice to have that face mask against the sand in the wilderness, wasn't it?
Just stop it getting up your nostrils.
So, just tell me a little bit about yourself. Can you just tell us who you are? Where have you come from?
Yeah, well, my name is Mrs. Yeshua, and you've just heard about me. You've just read about me in the Bible, actually. So I'm really, when I heard, it was the angel Gabriel happened to be, in passing, said there was a church in St. Andrews who was looking at our story in Ezra. And I said, oh, Gabriel, will you give me special dispensation to go down there? Because I'd love to tell the people in this place that I've never been to just what happened to us all those years ago when we went to Judah. So I'm really the wife. I was the wife of the priest Yeshua.
Oh, wow. And so you were there in Babylon, right? And so what was it like when you left there and you arrived in Jerusalem for the first time? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it was really very strange because all my life, people had been talking about those days in the past, the glory days. My parents remembered a bit, but my grandparents and their parents would talk about living in Judah, worshipping the God there in Jerusalem, and then they would cry. They would cry because they'd been deported. They had been taken away from their home to a foreign land, to very different ways, to different gods. And so I suppose all my life I had this sense that home was somewhere else. It was somewhere I didn't know at all, because I was used to living in Babylon. That was where I was born. The Babylonians were our neighbors. We'd planted vineyards, and they had grown, and we'd eaten the fruit, and we'd just been there so long. So it was just this place that was home, even though it was very unfamiliar. For Yeshua, my husband, it was a strange thing, because he came from a priestly family. And so all through his line, his father and his great-grandfather, etc., they had all been priests in the temple in Jerusalem, taking care of the sacrifices, collecting the tithes and offerings, sort of managing the religious festivals, etc. And when they were all taken off to Babylon, well, there was no temple left. And so, my father-in-law's father and his father, they sort of had nothing to do, and just felt really redundant. It was such an important job that they had done there in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden, people didn't really care about it. There was no offerings to offer. The temple didn't exist. And some people just got on with life and just, I don't know, perhaps forgot the God of Israel. But Yeshua's family, they just felt as if everything that they'd been called to do and to be had gone, and they were really sort of useless. So the moment Cyrus said, you can all go back to your homeland, I looked round, and there was Yeshua packing his bags. I mean, we hadn't even had lunch before he was ready to go. He was so keen to get back there. He said, listen, this is my calling. This is who I am. This is what God wants me to do, to lead God's people in the temple there in Jerusalem. It's in my genes, and I've got to go back and take everyone with me. Well, I wasn't so keen. There were the children, they were settled in schools, they had their friends, they knew, the way of life, etc. Lots of really good neighbors. What was going to happen to the stuff we'd planted? We wouldn't get to eat it, that harvest. So I was less keen. It took a bit of persuading, but you know what it is? You marry into the family. And I did have sort of priests, I did come from a priestly family myself, so there was a bit of sort of in my genes. And I knew that I had a responsibility to my husband, to my husband's family, and to the community. So we set off on this very long journey. Oh, goodness gracious, I could have turned around 100 times. And then we got there, and there were no big banners saying, "Welcome home, it's lovely to see you," no balloons. Just a heap of rubble, a mound of stones. And we all separated. We'd been traveling together, but we all separated. People went to their own land and began to think of building the future. And I just looked around Jerusalem and I thought, goodness, we've come this far for this.
So, but then in the story that we were reading tonight, we read something about a very special day while you were there in the rubble of Jerusalem. So what was it like that day in the 7th month that we read about?
Yeah, well, it was about this time of year, actually, which is interesting. Perhaps that's why Gabriel was talking about it. But it was actually just a wonderful, wonderful day when everything suddenly came into focus. That all the different people who'd scattered to the different towns where they came from, they came together, and it was so nice to see everyone catch up with what had been happening, to share stories, etc. All of a sudden, we were reminded that we were one people. And there was Jeshua, as usual, a man in charge at the forefront, and the governor as well was there with his helpers. And we went to the place where the altar was. And there were these just scattered stones, they'd just been left and abandoned. And Yeshua, my husband, and Zerubbabel and the others began to pick up the stones, to gather them. And they began to build the altar. The altar, I mean, I couldn't imagine what that looked like, because, of course, I didn't know anything about temples and altars, because we didn't have them in Babylon. There was no temple there to do anything. But there they were gathering the stones, and they began to build the altar. And I was surprised, the poignancy of it as they just moved the old rubble away and began to build the altar to God. And you know, Paulus, there was something about the place, that this was the place, before we were sent away, before we were deported, this was the place where the God of heaven and earth met us, his people. There's something about a place, isn't there? There's something about a stone that's so old, that has survived the centuries. There's something about it that links us here now to the past. There's a sense of sort of continuity. I'm holding the stone that perhaps my ancestors held all those years. And this was the very spot, as we stood around and watched Yeshua and Zerubbabel and the others, this was where our ancestors met with God. This is where they were formed as God's people. But also, as we looked at the rubble, this was also the place where it had all gone terribly wrong, where because of their sins, the whole altar had been destroyed. And yet here we were preparing to build the altar to our God in the place of failure. Also in the place of real fear, because there we were building this altar, and there were the neighbors all around who'd come to populate the area, and they would probably see that as a bit of a threat. And we were only a little rabble of people. We didn't have all the swords and whatever you need to fight people. So we were worried about what the neighbors would say. But actually on that day, we were just coming with the stones in our hand and saying, Lord, here we are. We're not waiting until we've got everything sorted in our community. We're not waiting until we've got a very nice temple, because of course we'd heard the stories of the temple with the gold and the beautiful stones and everything. We didn't have any of that. But we were saying, we have come. We are your people. We've come. And our focus is on the altar because our focus is to worship you. And we worship you just in the ruins. We worship you at a time of transition. We worship you in the place of failure and defeat and shame. We worship you in fear. But Lord, we also worship you in faith, and we worship you in hope. And hope because, you see, God had brought us back. God had made it possible for us to return. And it was like he was saying, I will do this again. I will build you again. I did meet you in exile. I'm not tied to this building and this place. I did meet you there in Babylon. But actually here, in this place, we have a deal. We have a special covenant. I have brought you this far, and this altar that you are building is a declaration of faith in what I will do and hope in what you can do, what I can do through you. And there was a feeling, that day as we saw that altar being built, that what we were watching wasn't just something just about Yeshua and me and the little group of people that were there. There was a sense in which something so much bigger was happening, that we were part of something in history. We didn't really understand it. We didn't know. But somehow God was doing a new thing, and he was doing it as we just put one stone on top of the altar. And we were just joining in what he was doing and wondering, okay, Lord, what are you going to do next?
Wow. So in the passage that we read, we also read about all these offerings that you were bringing on the altar. So So can you tell us a little bit about all these offerings? What is it about them all? What was God doing at that moment?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this was completely new. But I think what we were saying, that's what Yeshua kept saying. No, we're asking God, teach us. Teach us how to be your holy people again. Teach us how to be a people that worships you and shows you to the world. I mean, we all had to learn this afresh. I mean, Yeshua had the instructions that had been handed down from his family, but he had to do it for the first time. He put us right, because he usually does. But we'd never, ever done that before. It was new to us as well. So there were morning and evening sacrifices every day. There were the new moon sacrifices, so once a month. There were the weekly sacrifices. There were the special feasts that perhaps followed the year, and those were going to happen later. There was this free will offerings as well. And I think all of them, I mean, the priests were the ones that sort of did put us right, but I think all of them were saying, we're bringing together as your people, we are bringing what we have to you, to praise you, to thank you for what you have done, for your faithfulness in our life. We bring you our offerings because we have done what is wrong and we need you to forgive us. We come to confess that. We come together to celebrate that you have been faithful. You have been faithful on this journey that we have taken these last months. That you have been faithful in the harvest, in the food that will come. And that we're coming not as individuals, although we were individuals, we were families, but we are coming as your people, as a corporate group. And we had to learn that whole idea of community in this place at that time was something that we really had to learn afresh. What does it mean to be God's covenant people at this new time in our lives? And that reminder that we needed to focus on God morning and evening, every week, every month, in the seasons throughout the year. Because, when we arrived there in that new place, there was so much to do that we could have got so distracted growing our plants and building our houses and trying to work out what it was like to living in this new place. And Yeshua wanted to say right at the beginning, we have come together to meet our God, to be his people, to worship him. And that will be a priority. And day after day after day, we will remind ourselves of that because we need God's help in this new beginning that we're starting.
Mm-hmm. And so there was a new beginning, but before that, of course, there were challenging times, and even when you arrived. So what sustained you through those challenging times?
I suppose we needed to help each other to keep going, because just thankfully we all got discouraged at different times, so we would help each other in the building of it. And it was hard. When we arrived, we were tired. It had been a long, long journey. We were just relocating to start something new. We were exhausted. There were griefs. There were things that we had left behind that we really missed. There were things that we were sorry about that we couldn't go back to. The environment was possibly hostile. And sometimes there are people you travel with and you think, I wish we'd left them behind. I mean, Yeshua was often saying, if only old X, Y, or Z had stayed in Babylon, my life would be a whole lot easier. Because you don't pick your companions, do you? And perhaps that's part of God's plan. But these are offerings, these times of thanksgiving, of worship, of celebration, of sharing, because sometimes we would take our offerings and share them, the food, with those that were there. I think those really energized us for the task. They reminded us of our priorities and what was important. And I think for me, every time I thought of what Cyrus had said, this pagan king who knew nothing about our God and our worship, who'd said, you go back to your land and worship your God, thinking, God is in this, so much bigger than just our personal stories, so much bigger than our very limited understanding. But you know, what was really special those first few months was the Feast of Booths. Because that was a time that God had said, I want you to remember how I was faithful to you in the wilderness. That when you were trekking through the dirt and the dust, hoping for the promised land, these are our ancestors, years and years before, that I was with you. And the way I want you to remember is that once a year you're going to get out of your houses and you're going to build tents with leaves and branches, etc. And you're going to live there. And you're going to live the story of God providing for you in temporary accommodation. Well, we didn't need to imagine very much because actually we weren't quite in temporary accommodation even as we arrived back there. But there was just something about that reminder that our people had been there before, that God walks with us in the arid wilderness. God walks with us in our uncertainty. God walks with us when we don't know where we're going to end up. God walks with us when we arrive to a whole bunch of rubble. And actually the journey and the being in those temporary houses and being in touch in a new way with our ancestors who had known the faithfulness of God was a reminder, this is who we are. We worship a God who is in this place, but is also a God on the move. What was really important as well, Paulus, was involving our children. That this wasn't just us sort of doing an exercise. Our children hadn't seen the worship of God in this way before. And they loved collecting the branches and building them, and we had some really interesting booths. But it was really important at this new stage in our life for our children to be part of the history, to understand this is who they were in uncertain days, and that we worship a God that is always on the move, that does new things. But we worship also a God who has a foundation, a place here that is built on what he has revealed of himself in the past, what he tells us about himself in the law. I mean, it's interesting, Paulus, just before I get too carried away with that time, I mean, Angel Gabriel sort of said as much to me when I was about to come down, because he thought this might be a helpful story, perhaps for you in this neck of the wood, because as I understand it, you've been sort of scattered, you've been far away, and you're sort of beginning to come together, but you don't really know what it's going to look like. There are griefs that you've suffered on this journey, people that perhaps have stayed behind. And I mean, in a way for us, it was really important, if there's anything I want to say about this experience, was just allowing God, what was important for us was allowing God to shape us in our worship, to shape us in our community together, to shape us in prayer. And I wonder for you, what does your altar look like here, in this place and at this time?
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that whole story, because I mean, for all of us, that story speaks to us. Because like you said, yeah, we have been scattered for such a long time. And yeah, we have suffered as a church fellowship. And yeah, many people that couldn't come and see where we are now. But I think what really spoke to me through your story is that that the most important thing in all this is that as long as God is with us, we are fine. And so in a sense there, we can think about all the offerings that you mentioned in this story and all the ways that we like to worship here together. But I think the most important thing in all this is as long as God is with us, we are okay. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I hope that in these days, like us, he will, shape you for new things, built on the old, and there could be some exciting things in the future. Who knows what he will do, but don't forget to focus on him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something that, of course, comes with the story that you told us, is that once you arrive in that new country where there was nothing and you had to rebuild the altar from scratch, there is the opportunity to rebuild in a new way, perhaps. And so I think letting this story speak to us, one of the things that I hear you say and that encourages us is that, God is with us as we rebuild and as we explore perhaps new ways in which we can worship him that we haven't done before, and that he is always on the move and we follow him in that. Yeah.
Well, I was interested, because I couldn't help but listen, to your announcements. We didn't have many of them in our day, but I understand that there's a sort of new venture, newish, to do with prayer and praise, and I just wonder if Benji can help us to understand what's going on.
I can try my best.
So I'm just wondering, Benji, how did this sort of time of praise start?
All the way back at the beginning, during the first lockdown, I was living with James and Belinda and Hannah, and we realized that there was a lack of times of worship that we'd had in the past that were live and all together as a fellowship, and so we wanted to start. And that's when we started live living room worship, to try and create a space where people could come, join us online and worship live with us, and try and create a worshipful community, even though we were all in lockdown and in the pandemic.
So week on week, you were singing in a living room, and then it transitioned to here. And how did it work? I mean,
so initially it worked by people would request songs, and we would come up with songs as well, wanting to worship God just with whatever was on our hearts and whatever he gave to us, and just praising him despite all of the difficulties that we'd all been going through. Yeah.
So I guess it was, worship and a different type of rubble. And so now we hear that you're thinking of new things. So you've sort of developed this prayer side. So what are your dreams? And how do you think, how could you explain what will happen, say, next Saturday?
Yeah, so kind of as we were coming out of lockdowns and into more, I suppose, normal church, mostly, we've been kind of thinking that one of the aspects that is very important as part of worship is prayer, and the live living room worship in the past has kind of been missing that aspect a little bit. So next Saturday and last Saturday when we did this, we've got prayer stations that we're setting up downstairs so that there can be a time before we all come together and worship, where if people want to come, they can come and pray, and they can come and spend some time with God, and there's a space there which is different from any other space the church has, so that people can come and just spend some time with God and get close to him and open up their hearts to him before we all come together and then pour out our hearts in worship to him. So that's what we'll be doing next Saturday.
So that's exciting, isn't it? The way that God is leading his people, and who knows what will come of it. So thank you, Benji, and thank you, Paulus.